Kate Fisch is Associate Vice President of Eating Disorder Clinical Services for Odyssey's Eating Disorder Network. She's a licensed clinical social worker who earned her master's degree in social work from Washington University in St. Louis and her undergraduate degree in psychology from Indiana University, Bloomington. Kate has spent the entirety of her career focused on the field of eating disorder treatment and recovery. She has experience serving clients in all levels of care, from residential down to her own outpatient practice. And before joining Odyssey's Eating Disorder Network, Kate created Eating Recovery Academy and hosts a podcast by the same name. Both serve as a vehicle for Kate's passion in training other mental health clinicians in an effort to close the gap between the lack of available treatment and the enormous number of individuals and families who need support for eating disorder recovery. Kate furthers that endeavor through her role at Odyssey, where she supports executive and clinical directors at our residential programs in maintaining evidence-based care and innovating our clinical curriculums. So thank you, Kate, for being with our group today. And with that, I will hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. I apologize for all of that nonsense. Just when I think I'm starting to get the hang of things, I get a new computer or something, and then who knows? So, but I'm sure you all can understand. So I actually don't want to show this slide yet. There we go. Because first of all, what do you guys want to talk about today? Right. Oh, we're going to talk about ARFID. That's right. I have been saying ARFID so much lately, trying to prepare for this, this presentation. So there's a lot of you guys here, and that makes me very excited. I am thrilled actually to see how many of you want to expand your knowledge around eating disorder treatment and recovery. As many of you know, one of my favorite statistics to throw around, and I probably recite this once a day, is that there are, here, Michelle knows, there are 500,000 licensed mental health clinicians in the United States. Less than 2% of them treat eating disorders. In contrast, 28.8 million Americans will struggle with a eating disorder at some point in their lifetime. So obviously, there is an enormous gap there between available services and the people who need them. So knowing this, internalizing this, makes treating and supporting clinicians who are willing, interested, also passionate about learning how to treat eating disorders and learning more about recovery is such a passion of mine. And so I really appreciate you all taking time out today to learn about that. So also, I am thinking that this large number of attendees actually speaks to the growing need for all of us to learn how to treat ARFID. How many of you out there feel that you already have the skills to effectively treat ARFID within the scope of your discipline and practice? If you all raise your hand, right? Probably not. I'm assuming that you're all here because you don't really feel like you have those skills. So the amount of people, right, that we're seeing presenting now to us with ARFID continues to expand. And I think that's creating a growing urgency and anxiety in eating disorder clinicians, right, to find a solid treatment intervention that really can help these people. Because ARFID is such a new diagnosis, as we're going to talk a little bit more about, we are actually lacking in solid research about evidence-based treatments that can help us figure out how to most effectively, right, provide quality care. So I think we're getting there. I think we have some cool things in the hopper that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But I want you, as I'm presenting this, to do one favor, just in the back of your head, as we're talking about ARFID and as we're starting to talk about treatment, I want you to think about things that you already know, especially in terms of treatments or skills that you already use. Like, oh, that sounds familiar. All right, so let's get started. And I hope that at the end of this hour 15, depends on how fast I talk, you guys will feel a little bit more confident about supporting your ARFID clients. So let's move on. Okay. So today's objective, as always, right? Tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them what you told them. It's always the formula, right? So thing we're going to talk about today is we are going to further our base knowledge about the diagnostic criteria of ARFID and its differentiation from other eating and feeding disorders. We're going to talk about the diagnosis history and the current epidemiology. This part is, I mean, a year ago when we were doing this probably was new, but this information might not be new to most of you, as well as the clinical presentation and maybe even the proper assessment. But we are going to spend time on this because I don't believe that we can really apply interventions or treatment if we don't truly understand what ARFID looks like, right? And we don't truly understand who our ARFID affects, right? And who might be our target populations, right? Or who might be most vulnerable to developing the disorder. So I know it's boring, but just please hang in there with me. And also, I really like questions. And I hate waiting till the end if I'm currently talking about something. So if something's really bugging you or you've got something, please put it in the chat. And I'm going to try and remember to prompt Michelle to ask her if there are any questions, but I don't mind stopping at all. And I might not know the answer. So, all right, well, we're going to start at the beginning. And I'm actually going to read through this because it matters. So avoidant and restrictive food intake disorder. This is an eating or feeding disturbance. We're going to skip the parentheses for now because we're going to come back to that. As demonstrated by persistent failure to meet appropriate nutritional needs. This persistent failure presents in one of the following, at least one of the following ways: significant weight loss or weight suppression, right? I love how much we are including that in our description now of these diagnoses. Weight suppression is failure to achieve expected weight gain or growth in children. Or we could have significant nutritional deficiency, as we might show up in lab work. Iron deficiency, vitamin A deficiency can also be common in these folks. Any other electrolyte imbalances. And then another factor is dependence on tube feeding or oral nutritional supplements. And then the last one is the marked interference with psychosocial functioning. And the way that the examples that I give here are, you've got a kiddo that is just so limited in what they're willing to eat that the family can't go anywhere. There's no going out to dinner. There's no going to friends' houses, right? That is a marked disturbance in the social functioning of the family. So, which I think you're going to find in most of the clients, right? This is at least one of the following. There's usually more than one. So this one is really important. This next bullet point is the disturbance does not occur during the course of anorexia or bulimia nervosa. And there is no evidence of negative self-evaluation based on body shape or size or fear of weight gain. And then the disturbance is not due to a medical condition. So I really want you to remember this piece about there is a lack of negative self-evaluation based on body shape and size and a lack of fear of weight gain. All right, let's talk a little bit about the history. So I'm sure all of you are aware, and that's probably why we're here, that the ARFID diagnosis is pretty new. It was first added to the DSM-5 in its debut in 2013. It was formerly known as feeding disorder of infancy and early childhood in the DSM-4, also called selective eating disorder. But when we started to really evaluate this diagnosis, we realized that it was actually rarely used. So when those real smart people got together and started to revamp the DSM-4 and put out the DSM-5 with hopes of being even more accurate in their organization and categorizing of mental disorders, they found that only 12% of the children that were presenting with any feeding issues were actually meeting the criteria for feeding disorder of infancy and early childhood. So we're missing the mark here. This probably is going to sound familiar to a lot of you who remember the DSM-4 and how like up to 80% of people diagnosed with an eating disorder were actually being diagnosed with EDNOS, eating disorder not otherwise specified, because the criteria for bulimia and anorexia was so limiting, which is why they changed those criteria as well. Let's see, what else did I want to tell you? So they changed this diagnosis into ARFID, and they wanted to expand the criteria so they could include more people more people who were struggling with feeding disorders. So first thing that they did was they included criteria that included people of all ages across the age spectrum. The feeding disorder of infancy and early childhood obviously did not include adolescents, young adults, or people, I want to say geriatric, is that right? I don't know why that word sounds funny to me. I think you know what I mean. And then another way is that the ARFID diagnosis, the new ARFID diagnosis, focused more on malnutrition rather than low body weight. Again, sounds familiar, right, to atypical anorexia versus anorexia, trying to include that weight suppression as criteria rather than just low body weight. Because as we know, right, eating disorders come in all different shapes and sizes. Someone can be at their ideal body weight and still be incredibly malnourished, right? Still have deficiency in their nutrients, so their nutritional health. And then also the last thing that they did, was actually allow the diagnosis to include people who were struggling with other medical diagnoses as long as the ARFID was significantly the cause of the malnutrition. So again, the hope there was to expand who we were covering. And then, I have this cool statistic too, where people who, a 2009 study found that only 29% of people struggling with feeding disorders were underweight, which again goes back to that statistic that I think we're all familiar now, that only 6% of people with eating disorders are actually medically underweight, right? So I know I use that one a lot to help my clients understand that yes, you are sick enough. So, any questions so far about that?
Yes, so there's a few questions while we're still on the topic of diagnosis. We have one that is sort of like the trajectory of this concern type question. Is it common for kids with ARFID to develop anorexia or bulimia or OSFID as they enter adolescence?
Yes, the answer is yes. And we are going to talk about that in a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, I thought maybe that was to come. And then
but that's a good question.
Also a few questions about gender related to ARFID. So what about?
We're going to talk about gender. We're going to talk about prevalence.
Great.
It's coming up.
Great.
All right. This is not going to be new. So not surprisingly, when we wonder how ARFID develops, it's no surprise that it resembles that of other eating disorders. And the way that I like to describe that, as many of you do as well, is the biopsychosocial model of development. So there are, just as other eating disorders, biological factors such as genetics and temperamental traits. Interestingly, heritability of ARFID is 48 to 74% higher than it is in anorexia. And we already know how high it is in anorexia. It's actually, I think if it's an immediate member of your family, you're 11 times more likely to develop anorexia. Psychological factors, of course, such as the presence of obsessive compulsive behaviors or any anxiety around food or eating. Social and environmental factors that might contribute are exposure to dieting or restrictive eating at home, cultural healthy appearance ideals, and also noted are religious beliefs around food and food preparation. A lot of concern or talk about the morality of food really underpinning somebody's food avoidance or lack of intake. So Thomas and Eddie, those are actually their last names, not their first names, but it sounds like I'm really familiar with them. They are two of the top researchers for ARFID. And in 2017, they released a study where they took those, remember that part of the parentheses and the diagnosis that I said we're going to skip that for now. They really kind of expanded on that and started to look at different motivations behind the three most typical presentations of ARFID. So we are going to go through the three on the left first, and then revisit the two on the right. So the first type is called avoidant ARFID, or avoidant type ARFID. The researchers also use the word domain. So avoidant ARFID is where someone avoids certain types of food in relationship to its sensory features. So they might have a sensitivity to the smell of foods or to the texture of foods. That's really common. To the general appearance of food, like color. They know now that a lot of these individuals are known as super tasters. So they actually experience specific tastes more intensely than other people. So that, and those super tastes include most likely bitter and sweet. So an example of, and I'm going to say child a lot, but yes, ARFID does happen across the age spectrum. So I don't want you to think it's just limited to children. It just shows up a lot more in kids. So an example of avoidant ARFID would be a child who tries a radish for the first time. I don't know why I always use radish, but I like that example because it's not, even for us not super tasters, it's still not necessarily the most pleasant. Not always the most pleasant taste. And so the super taster though, right, that experience of eating a radish is going to be even more intense and probably even more unpleasant, right? Now, as you guys know, our brains are wired to help us avoid distress, right? So this child might then associate that awful experience with the radish, might associate that with all vegetables. And then later, furthering, right, their need to stay safe, they might add fruits to that list of foods too, because of their association with vegetables. So as we all know, this avoidance strategy works to strengthen the perceived distress, right? And then it perpetuates the avoidance, right? Also, I'm assuming, as you guys have already guessed, just based on the description, that this domain, ARFID avoidant, has the highest rate of people with co-occurring autism spectrum disorder. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, right? And that is based on some of those sensory overstimulation. Oh, that would have been helpful. Sorry, guys. The next type is aversive ARFID, or aversive domain. So in this category, the individuals here refuse or avoid food based on a fear of an aversive consequence. So an example, or some examples of the adverse consequences, can be choking, vomiting, nausea, GI pain, or even fear of an allergic reaction. And the fear, really, it's phobic, right, is so big that they might even refuse food altogether. I like to give an example of a client that I've worked with who presented with an eating disorder, but as an adult, is going to speak to that first question. As we started going back and unraveling, we found that she had witnessed her uncle choke, I think on a piece of apple or a hard fruit, when she was 10 years old. He survived, but since that point, she stopped eating really any hard or solid food and stopped eating when she was moving. She had associated that. And then it later turned into anorexia nervosa. But I like to use that choking phobia, and choking phobias and vomiting phobias are not rare within the context of people who present with phobias. So, okay, lots of people though do have aversive experiences with food, right? I mean, raise your hand if you've had food poisoning in your life. But I just did. Not a pleasant experience, right? But we don't develop ARFID. So what this is getting us to assume, or maybe want to explore more, is that there's some sort of underlying predisposition to develop those phobias or to have those anxiety disorders. That are then kind of unlocked when they have that traumatic experience or witness a traumatic experience. Again, that behavior gets reinforced, right? Because they're avoiding. And when they're avoiding, their brains aren't able to test out, right? That hypothesis. And rather they just kind of assume that that's what's going to happen. And then over and over, it just gets reinforced, right? Hard food means we're going to choke, means we're going to die. We better eat soft food. This last domain is restrictive ARFID. These are folks who have no appetite or low appetite. They might not experience hunger cues, or they might have premature fullness. And what happens over time is that food just becomes a chore. They're not interested in food. It's kind of a hassle, right? They may not actually be getting that feel-good feeling that we get when we eat, right? That then reinforces us to keep eating or to eat again. And so what happens is that adults are hassled. They may forget to eat altogether, or they just can't be bothered with it. And then in kids, they often get distracted at meal times and have a hard time completing a meal. We think that this might be some abnormalities in the brain's appetite regulating center. They notice when they study people who participate in intermittent fasting that their hypothalamus is underactivating, right? So they stop getting those hunger cues, or it might be an organic problem, right? Like maybe they were born without the ability to sense that hormone release that cues us for hunger. Oops. So if you look on the right here, you will see that there are two other, really we're just going to focus on this ARFID plus. So Thomas and Eddie, when they released this study in 2017, didn't include ARFID plus as one of those three common domains or subtypes of ARFID. I'm kind of on the fence with this one. So technically ARFID plus refers to somebody who has one or more of the three most common subtypes. However, they also might be kind of on their way to developing another eating disorder diagnosis. So it's important to know that avoidant, restrictive, aversive, those circles are kind of overlapping because none of those domains are mutually exclusive. Anybody with ARFID can have one, two, or three of those, or have features of one, two, or three of those domains. Where I kind of put ARFID plus over there, having the same features maybe as an other eating disorder diagnosis. I have a hard time with it because, I mean, the actual diagnostic criteria for ARFID says that it can't happen within the context of anorexia or bulimia, specifically because if you have ARFID, you do not have negative self-evaluation with body shape and size, and you don't have that fear of weight gain. So I get where they're going because yes, if you have ARFID as a child, you have a higher likelihood of developing an eating disorder later in life. So I get why we've developed that one, but I'm not sure that that fits quite yet, or I just need to know more. So what I do is if I'm consulting on a client, they show up and someone has given them a diagnosis of anorexia nervosa and ARFID, I still think something's wrong there with the diagnosis, and want to go back and draw my own conclusion. Okay, so we're going to switch to prevalence and epidemiology, but before we do, any questions on the subtypes? Do we all feel clear with those examples that I gave, or do you need some more examples?
There was a question, I think, on that last slide when you talked a little bit about time management related feeding issues. Someone did have a question about how appropriate is it for those with ADHD to avoid food and or struggle with time management to have an ARFID diagnosis.
So people with ARFID diagnoses are more likely or to have a co-occurring ADHD
Yes.
diagnosis, as you see on the next slide, which presents a real problem, right? Because lots of treatment for ADHD has appetite suppression features, right? So they're not even having the appetite to begin with. So then you don't medicate them, but then they're so distracted by the ADHD that they can't focus on the meal. So it's kind of, it's a, can't win for trying or can't, win for losing or whatever that expression is. It's definitely a problem. Was there anything else, Michelle?
Related to age breakdown, we did just get a question about, is there a higher frequency of the restrictive type in general population, GUC?
In geriatric?
Yes, geriatric.
I don't know. That's a really good question. I'd love to know what that thought process was. Just like just losing the appetite. I guess I'm thinking a little bit of like, maybe that part of the brain is deteriorating and you're not getting those cues anymore.
Right. I guess as appetites trends change in the elder population, if that would be a reason for the diagnosis or actually be exclusionary for the diagnosis.
Good. Those are really good questions. Write that down. Find the answer and let me know.
Sounds good.
Okay, again, boring stuff, but this is important because we need to know who's most at risk for ARFID. And I want to share, there's not a lot out there, right? There's just not a lot of like big studies. So this information you're going to see when I'm going through this, there's huge ranges because we have very limited studies, right? And they're all kind of saying different things. And so that's why some of the ranges are so big. But right now, the most recent study that was looking at lots of different studies, including one that was done as recent as 2021, tried to find the most up-to-date stuff, says that the prevalence of ARFID among the general population is anywhere from 0.3% to 15.5%. Just thinking about like all the people in my life that I, have food stuff, I'm thinking maybe 15% isn't that high. But I also think that I look through everything through the lens of an eating disorder clinician. So I might be biased on that. When we study and look at the prevalence of ARFID within the context of the eating disorder population, it seems to affect males more often with up to 50% meeting criteria. Conversely, though, when we look at ARFID presenting in the general population, it seems to affect both males and females equally. So we definitely need to collect some more data there. I need some clarification on that. ARFID, let's see, presents at a younger age than other eating disorder diagnoses. And it's typically longer in its duration, but ultimately it has better recovery rates. So let me kind of go through some of that. So the age of onset for ARFID is typically like 11 to 14 and a half compared to anorexia, which is 14 to 15 and a half. And then bulimia, 15 to kind of 16.7. Duration, ARFID usually lasts between a year and 33 months, where other eating disorders, the duration of the disorder on average is between 8 and that shouldn't be 33. That should be 23, 8 and 23 months. And then we all know, right, that eating disorders do not discriminate on body shape and size, but also not on race or ethnicity. But we don't have comprehensive studies. One study I did find was that in 2016, between 9 and 11% of individuals in Japan between ages of 15 and 40 would meet criteria for ARFID, which I thought was pretty interesting. This is going to be no surprise, but ARFID is more common in specific clinical populations, and it does have high rates of comorbidity with other medical and psychiatric issues. So not surprising at all is this statistic that up to 72% of people have a co-occurring anxiety disorder. I think I've heard up to 84% as well in another study. This was the study that I think is the most recent study. Studies that show, or there are studies that also show that, like I mentioned earlier, 21 to 28% of kids diagnosed with ARFID are also meet criteria for an autism spectrum disorder. And then we also talked about them having a higher rate of co-occurring ADHD as well. And then we have co-occurring medical issues. So a 2022 study found that 57% of people diagnosed with, I really spelled that, celiac disease also met criteria for ARFID. And then this aligns with actually a 2015 study that showed that up to 44% of people presenting with ARFID also report co-occurring GI issues. So I don't know about you guys, but I have to wonder, and I always want to ask these people these questions, but is this a chicken or an egg kind of situation, right? So did the individual have GI pain which created the aversion to food, right? Like the aversive type, or did they have avoidance type ARFID to begin with, and then went to eat and have gastroparesis or a stomach emptying issue that is actually secondary to the ARFID. So I'd be interested to learn more about that as well. But I'm wondering these things out loud because I want you guys to start wondering things out loud as well. Just because we don't have, academic papers in front of us about this disorder doesn't mean that we can't gather our own information, and doesn't mean that our clinical experience of these individuals isn't valid, right? Hopefully, the conclusions that we draw on what works best with these clients will only be validated in the future by evidence-based literature, right? Okay.
Hey, quickly, if while we're on this slide still, do you know off the top of your head, based on the research you read, I guess the percentage of overlap between ASD diagnosis that also meet the criteria for ARFID? So how frequently those things are happening together for clients? And
yeah, no, I only know the way where the ARFID kids are 21. Yeah, I only know that direction.
Okay.
Yeah. So right along the lines of why I'm going through all this boring stuff first, is that, if we don't know what we're looking for and we don't know, the clinical presentation, right, of an eating disorder, then we're not going to know how to plan our treatment, and we're not going to know what to expect in terms of recovery. And so part of that, right, is completing an assessment of what's going on. So we're going to talk a little bit more about an evidence, or that Jennifer Thomas, the researcher that I talked about, referred to before, developed CBT specific for Avoidant for ARFID. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But in that research, they developed and were able to find validity and reliability in the party interview, so the PICA, ARFID, and rumination disorder interview, and it's free and accessible to anybody. And you guys are going to get all of this information, so don't worry too much about frantically writing down that bizarre internet link. I just wanted to put it up there in case anybody wanted to see it in real time. Another assessment tool that's often used is the 9-item ARFID screen, developed but that's for kiddos. That works best for kiddos. I want you guys to not feel like you have to develop a brand new initial evaluation form just for ARFID people. Pull out the same one that you use, whether you're a dietitian or a therapist, pull out the same one that you use, and go through and make sure that you're adding in questions that might be relevant for ARFID or that you're exploring a little bit more. So if someone doesn't come in presenting with ARFID, but maybe comes in with a feeding issue, that you can start to differentiate between the eating disorder diagnoses you feel more comfortable with and the ARFID diagnosis. So just want to kind of stimulate that thinking a little bit, where we talk about other important information to gather. Kids just aren't really good reporters. So, we want to make sure that we are asking parents or caregivers for collateral information. And oftentimes people have never heard of ARFID, right? Or have never heard of an eating disorder. And so their insight into what's going on could be really low. So we might also then want to, for adults, right, ask their partners or loved ones as well for collateral information. You're going to want, whether you're a dietitian or a therapist, looking for ARFID or any eating disorder. I cannot tell you how important it is to gather information about a typical day's food intake, because that's where we really are going to start to understand what some of the behaviors are. So for ARFID, right, we might be gathering what they eat in a day and start to notice, wow, you're only eating yellow foods, right? Or you're only eating carbohydrates, or I don't see any protein here, right? So then that's going to help kind of click, hey, that, ARFID's in the running here. If you're not quite sure what type of eating disorder you're already assessing. And then if you do notice that there's lack of variety, or there's something off, you can ask for a list of preferred foods or feared foods. And then, of course, right, this is what differentiates ARFID from anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa, right? And many of the otherwise specified eating and feeding disorders is that feeding and eating disorders is weight, shape concerns and fear of weight gain, right? So if you're talking and you notice that they only eat yellow foods and they don't eat any protein at all, then you might then want to say, okay, all right, let's put a pin in a potential ARFID. And then if you start to talk about body image and how they feel about their body and how they would feel about gaining weight, and they're like, no, I'm not gaining weight, I had terrible body image, then you can cross the ARFID off the list. Any questions about that? ARFID, just like any eating disorder, right? It's going to have that best practice standard that we are going to have a treatment team approach, right? And it's going to be multidisciplinary. So of course, we're going to use a therapist, dietitian, got to have a medical provider. Ideally, dietitian and medical provider are knowledgeable about ARFID as much as they can be, or at least open to learning more. The medical provider has to be eating disorder sensitive no matter what, because the adverse medical effects of ARFID are the same as the nutritional deficiencies in any of the other eating disorder diagnoses. And if they need to weight restore, those same risks are present as well. Recovery coach, if you have the opportunity to add a certified recovery coach to your team, no matter what eating disorder diagnosis you're treating, I absolutely would. And then kind of the cool thing about ARFID is that your team needs to get a little bit bigger. So often we will include other professionals like speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, ABA professionals. So, and to explain this and why they're necessary, I think it's important to understand that if you have ARFID, right, you've been avoiding certain foods or certain types of foods for so long, maybe even as long as you can remember, that it may, you might need evaluation and potential intervention for musculoskeletal maldevelopment or any developmental issues. So had a case of a younger kid that I worked with that came in, another little guy who had a fear of choking. And he wouldn't eat anything hard ever. It was just soft foods. Mostly he just wanted fluid. And, parents came in concerned, And they said that he had always been like that as long as they could remember. And we sent him to look at occupational therapist who started to look at his throat and the muscles that were in the jaw and in the neck, and realized this kid hasn't been swallowing hard food for the majority of his life. So those muscles around the jaw and in his throat and his chest that work to help us swallow food, right, never developed. And weren't really strong enough. So then you put hard food in his mouth, or you get him to eat something hard, and he really does feel like he's choking, right? Which then will only perpetuate the beliefs, the faulty beliefs associated with ARFID. So speech and language therapists are really, really good at helping teach people how to swallow. They're able to address that's what dysphagia is, right? Is the inability to swallow correctly. Occupational therapists and physical therapists are really good at helping to strengthen the muscles necessary to appropriately swallow. And then because we have such a high rate of co-occurring ASD diagnoses, it is great to have somebody who's knowledgeable about ABA interventions, any sort of behavior management interventions on the team as well. Okay, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about some of the current treatment that's in the works, and we're two specifically, and most likely are going to be our kind of our golden interventions, right? Like enhanced. Well, this is kind of funny. I feel like whenever we start trying to figure out how to treat something, we just throw some CBT at it and see if it sticks. Like it's the CBTE for eating disorders, a transdiagnostic CBT intervention. And I know there's others as well. So we did that here too, which does make sense, right? CBT is intuitive, it's approachable, works for young and old alike. And it doesn't rely on a lot of abstract thinking, right? And so folks who maybe are nutritionally depleted and have cognitive impairments because of those nutritional deficiencies would probably have an easier time understanding some of the concepts of CBT. So I get why we want to throw CBT at it. But sometimes it's like, let's mix it up a little bit. But this is Jennifer Thomas and Cameron Eddy. They're the Harvard gurus that have developed this treatment, that are sending it currently through trials to continue to develop the literature so that, and the foundation so that can be created as evidence-based. It is a manualized intervention. For those of you that have ever opened up the RODBT manual, you'll know what I mean, or read Fairburn's Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Enhanced for Eating Disorders, or even Marsh Linehan's DBT manual, right? Like it's manualized. It's step 1, step 2. This is what you're going to do in session 15. This is what session 18 looks like. This is how you start a session. This is how you end a session. And I get it, right? It needs to be manualized so that we can study it and we can truly do it the same every single time. So we can measure and evaluate its validity and its reliability, right? And its quality, essentially. So this is the same. This is a manual. I have it laying around here somewhere. If you haven't seen it though, I actually like this one because it really is approachable, and they do really write it for a clinician, for a somewhat experienced clinician. Whereas I feel like some other ones aren't so intuitive. But this CBT, it's going to feel a lot like any other CBT. We're going to have the first stage, which is going to be really focused on psychoeducation and early change. This is also where we focus a lot on weight restoration, nutritional rehabilitation. We educate parents on, like FBT, right? The urgency of needing nutritional rehabilitation or being deficient. And also we educate that this isn't something that parents can put on their kid, or we can't really blame the kid and we can't blame the parents. Of course, there's contributing factors, but in alignment with Adele France's emotion-focused family therapy, we immediately want to remove that blame, right? Because it's not going to get us anywhere. It's just going to burn us out. Second stage, treatment planning. I want to go back and emphasize again how important it is to truly understand what your client is going through with a really, really comprehensive assessment. But also you have to have as much knowledge as you possibly can about ARFID so that you can have some sort of general prediction of the course of treatment. And treatment planning, as much as we don't like it, it really is essential to guiding all of our clinical decisions. So treatment planning is essential. And then stage 3 is really that heavy stage where we address the maintaining mechanisms of each of the ARFID subtypes. So I very much recommend this book, mostly because, and you actually don't have to get the book. They have some of these materials online. It's cognitive behavioral therapy for avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. It's not a mystery, but its title's not a mystery. But it has some really cool ideas in stage 3. So like, for example, how to incorporate like new foods and for people who have like that sensory sensitivity, or maybe even the fear of adverse consequences type. They call one style deconstruction. So if one of the goals is that the client wants to be able to eat pizza, right, they'll give them a plate that has all the components of pizza, but separated, deconstructed, right, on the plate. And then they can work their way through what they feel most comfortable with over time. Another one is called a fading. And this is where a dietitian or a parent might slowly start to incorporate a taste. So, if oatmeal is safe, but they want to start incorporating more fruits, the parent or the nutritionist, dietitian might slowly add in some applesauce, right? So over time, they are habituating to that sensation or that taste of applesauce, and hopefully will be able to increase their threshold, right, for that type of food. And there's other examples of that too in this manual. So I would definitely check it out if you can. And then stage 4, right, as always, is relapse prevention.
Hey, could you say one more time the name of the book and the author, please, for the audience?
Sure. The authors are Jennifer Thomas and Cameron with a K, Kamryn, Eddy, Eddy. Looks like this. If you can see it. Cognitive behavioral therapy for avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And when you guys get the slides, it'll also be in the references as well. But you can get this on Amazon. And they do a really, really good job in this book too of synthesizing all the existing literature out there, which is nice. So I just want to put a pin in CBT-AR for just a second. I want to move on to another treatment that's currently in clinical trials and will probably become a standard treatment. And this one is for younger kids. And this one is super cool. This is Dr. Nancy Zucker. She developed this method. She's out of Duke University, and she wrote a paper, released it in 2018, and her method is called Feeling and Body Investigators, ARFID division. So she calls it FBI. And I love it because I'm a huge AC or acceptance and commitment therapy fan, and I feel like it is very much in line with those principles. So she describes it as acceptance-based interoceptive, we can talk about that word in just a minute, exposure treatment for young children, typically 10 and under. the goal of this treatment is to decrease the ARFID symptoms while also increasing general self-regulation skills. And then there's family collaboration, of course, because these are little kiddos, and a lot of psychoeducation for the parents as well. So the article is super approachable. Again, not one of these like academic, like mind busters that nobody wants to get into. It will also be in the references. It's easy to find online. It's free. And she includes examples of the work that she does with the kids. So one of the ways she describes her method is she will have the parents draw an outline of the kid's body in one of the very first sessions. And then the kid comes back and talks about where in their body, right, they feel pain or distress. And then they really start to explore. She even has like colorful characters that represent different types of feelings, and really helps the kids, I think, neutralize and become curious, right? Curiosity helps us neutralize, becomes curious about this. And a little bit, in my opinion, of that neurofeedback, right? Being able to say, gosh, when this gremlin is in my stomach, I notice that I get anxious, right? So maybe, when I notice I get anxious, I can take deeper breaths. Interoceptive, we're going to see that word again in a minute. It is the perception of, for those of you who don't know, I didn't know until recently, the perception of your internal body sensation. So some of us have a higher sense of interoceptive insight than other people. Let's see. Okay. Any questions about those two?
There was a question, I'm not sure if this is on the next slide, about John Locke's FBT-AR.
It's coming.
Great. Okay.
I don't talk about John Locke's FBT-AR. I just talk about FBT.
Okay.
So. Okay. So how much time do I have? 15 minutes? I think that's all I need. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. So this is typically where I'm going to take a left turn, right? And after 2 decades of being in this field, I've learned that although manualized forms of treatment are really helpful, like I mentioned earlier, they're not particularly practical in the real world clinical setting. And maybe there are some of you out there who love going session by session and following the instructions. But I find that in real life, sitting in this office, in this chair, and clients over here, that's just not realistic. It's not going to happen. And we're not going to be able to develop the rapport and the trust that we need and the flexibility, right, that we need. So of course, it is important to plan and practice treatment according to best practice standards, right? And use evidence-based practice interventions whenever available. But again, following a session-by-session treatment manual in everyday life just is rarely possible. So sometimes though, when I say these things, I'm always afraid that like some academic institution is going to like fire me from this field, or like I'm going to get struck by a bolt of lightning because I've said something wrong. But in particular with ARFID, these people that are presenting at our doors right now need help, right? And there's a sense of urgency, and we can't say, I'm sorry, I can't treat you right now. I'm waiting on this evidence-based treatment manual to come out. And for me to learn how to do it. So like, I'll call you in 6 months, right? We don't have that luxury. We don't have luxury of time. And so what I'm suggesting, right, is that we use what we know, and we use what we already feel really confident with. So we know where to start, right? Hopefully you all know where to start. When we're treating eating disorders, this we know to be true, right? We're going to round up our treatment team. Hopefully they're on speed dial, or they're already in your office, or already in your center. We're going to focus on medical and psychiatric stabilization. first, right? Work towards nutritional rehabilitation and weight restoration if that's needed, right? Because we can't treat anybody who's not cognitively with it. We know that it's best practice to involve family, caregivers, and partners in treatment. And we also know it's best practice and most efficient when we set goals along with the client or the family, right? Where they participate in that goal setting. We just don't tell them what we're going to do. So that's where we know to start. And then I kind of want to take, hopefully a little bit of the rest of the time and talk about the tools that we already have in our toolbox, right? Hopefully, as I've been talking, you guys have already recognized that many of the symptoms and the behaviors of ARFID could probably be addressed with some of the interventions that you use with other eating disorder patients, such as exposure and response therapy, right? Interoceptive awareness training, family-based treatment, DBT, and of course, we can throw some CBT on it. That you already probably feel really comfortable with those skills, right? And so while we're waiting to figure out the absolute best way to treat ARFID, I think that, you know, you're probably, right, this familiarity you're hearing as I'm going through, you're probably already on the right track, right? So let's walk through some of these maybe in the context of ARFID, hopefully to stimulate some thinking. Does anybody have anything to say about any of that, by the way, or any questions? I don't know if I lost people.
I had said to our group in the chat that I've got some that I'm saving for the end, which we're going to have time for.
Okay. Okay, so exposure response and prevention therapy, obviously this was talked about in the CBT AR, right? And, you know, we already know how to do that. Most of us do, right? In the context of treating eating disorders, we know how to build an anxiety hierarchy, right? We know how to slowly at times walk them through desensitization, learn to measure their own anxiety. This is going to be a great tool to work with avoidant clients where appropriate, right? We also have to take in any other co-occurring things, their age, things like that. Interoceptive awareness training, I am really geeked out about right now. If you guys get a chance to just even Google it, it's really cool. It was, and maybe I'm just slow to the party, but it was developed originally for panic disorder. And it does feel a lot like ERPT, but it focuses on, like I said before, the internal body sensations. So one example that I know that they use for people who have panic attacks, right, is that they'll have them breathe through like a cocktail straw, like a little tiny thin one, for 120 seconds and just breathe through that, right? And it's supposed to simulate shortness of breath, right, which then may kick out that panic disorder. And a lot of panic disorder, right, is the fear of having a panic attack. And so it kind of empowers that person to say, look, you can induce this and then catch your breath and it goes away, right? It doesn't, you are in control. It doesn't have to get into a full-blown panic attack. And that feeling of tightness in your chest and shortness of breath is nothing to be afraid of. We can do this too. An example would be a client that might have fear of vomiting, which in turn leads to distress when they're feeling nauseous, right? One intervention that's suggested is spinning around in a chair in your office several times to induce that feeling of nausea, and then realizing, right, challenging that faulty belief that this feeling won't last forever. That in fact, after a few minutes of sitting still, the dizziness will subside and the nausea will subside, right? And hopefully you actually won't vomit, right? So we're kind of we're experimenting, right? We're breaking that association. Family-based treatment. This is interesting. So before we really understood that ARFID was different than picky eating, there was a group out there that said you can't force your kids to eat and that will only make their picky eating worse. But now we know in our right family-based treatment and treating eating disorders that know that they're going to die if they don't eat, and so we need to feed them. And we're going to sit at the table, right? Literally and metaphorically until our kids eat. And another key piece, and I forgot to say this to add to assessment, but this is one that you're going to want to star, is that picky eaters, when faced with little or no options of their preferred foods, will ultimately find something to eat. People with ARFID will choose hunger over having to eat one of their feared foods. So that's another kind of golden question that can help you really understand if you're dealing with ARFID or if you're dealing with a picky eater. I am sure you guys heard lots of areas for DBT skills, right, to be used as an intervention. Of course, distress tolerance skills. We can also help our folks be mindful, right, to help them get a little bit more ease and not so much anxiety around meal times. And then, of course, CBT interventions. We can always use those, challenge faulty beliefs and distortions around any aversive consequences. Okay. I'm tired of hearing myself talk, so I'm glad I'm at the end. So current and future needs, obviously, this goes without saying, we need larger scale studies, not only further understanding about ARFID, but to also validate, right, the evidence-based treatments. Individuals seeking services for ARFID will most likely grow. One of the statistics I came across when I was doing research for this was a study in 2009 that asked Canadian pediatricians if they were familiar with or had heard of ARFID before, and 64% said no, which is, you know, scary, right? But we're doing, or I guess at that point it wasn't called ARFID, but we are doing a much better job of educating our gatekeepers, right? And with our kids, our gatekeepers are gonna be those medical folks, those pediatricians, the GI specialists. We're doing a much better job of educating them, which is great, which is why I think we're seeing more and more ARFID, but it's only gonna, you know, they're only gonna keep coming. And right now it's us and the eating disorder centers, right, that are charged with treating them. In my opinion, we are going to end up, I think, in a place where we're going to need ARFID specific treatment centers because of those differences in body image distress and fear of weight gain. But right now, what we have are our eating disorder centers. And so as clinicians, we're going to have to do what we're trained to do, and that's adapt, right, and use what we know to figure out a way to best meet the needs of these folks, right? Because like I said before, there is urgency. They are probably already on your caseload. I'm assuming you're here because you're anxious about how to treat them. And if you take anything away from today, it's more is coming, right? Check out CBT-AR, check out FBT-AR, check out the FBI, Nancy Zucker's intervention. But in the meantime, I want you to feel confident in using what you already know and what you already feel comfortable. And what we already know is an evidence-based intervention, right? Because the need for that is urgent and we don't have time to wait. So I think that's all I have to say. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I have some references here. We're going to send that PowerPoint out to you with more resources as well, because I like learning and I hope you guys do too.